Good evening. I'd like to call to order the Lakewood City Council study session of June 3rd, 2019 at 7 p.m. in chambers. And before we do the roll, we'll do a more formal moment of silence, but certainly want to let our friends in Virginia Beach know that we're thinking about them. Metro Wastewater Reclamation District. And I also want to acknowledge, and we'll probably cover this, but our resident representative on the board, Mr. Mark Hunter, who is joining us tonight. We all appoint him. And also want to mention we get a 2-for-1 because he serves on the board of urban drainage, not as a Lakewood rep, but that means we get 2 Lakewood voices. Mr. Hutchison, good evening.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, City Council. I just want to take a couple of minutes to introduce this topic and our main speaker about the Metro Wastewater Reclamation District. This is a very important aspect of the partnership that's necessary to have good health and a good environment in this community, in Lakewood specifically and in the larger metropolitan area. In Lakewood specifically, all of the entities, and I know you're aware that there are 20 or so that collect wastewater from different properties throughout the community, all ultimately discharge to the Metro Wastewater Reclamation District for sewage treatment. And then ultimately the cleaned water is then discharged to the South Platte River. So it's a very important organization. It's one that we partner with very closely, as do many other elected bodies within the city of Lakewood. I do want to distinguish one thing for you and the rest of the audience. The first word in this organization's name is district, and the last one is metro, and the last one is district. And if you put those two together, it sounds like another topic that perhaps you've heard a lot about in recent months and perhaps years. This is a different district. It's not a metropolitan district. It's not a tool utilized for land development. It's very much a single purpose district created by the state, and I want to make that distinction. Another distinction that's important is that it doesn't treat stormwater runoff. It treats the wastewater that goes down through the drains in your home, through business drains, toilets, showers, all those kinds of things. And when you think about the size of the metropolitan area, that's a big job. The stormwater treatment, however, is handled in different ways and not by this organization. So I also want to make that distinction. With those comments, I want to introduce Mickey Conway, who is the district manager and has been since January of 2018. Mr. Conway's been in this industry for about 25 years in both private sector and public sector roles. And with that, I will introduce the district manager of the Metro Wastewater Reclamation District and a Colorado native, Mr. Conway.
All right. Thank you, sir. Good evening. Welcome.
Good evening. Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity, the mayor, the council, Jay, and I also want to thank Mark Hunter, who's here, one of our board members, long tenured, a lot of experience, represents Lakewood with passion and knowledge, and we're really fortunate to have Mark and our board members to guide us. That's one of the reasons I'm standing here. In 2016, our board launched a new strategic plan, and part of what we wanted to do was we were kind of the quiet wastewater treatment entity, kept our head under the radar, and we realized as we're going forward that we can't really do that anymore. We've got to go out and speak with our connectors, talk to them about what's important to them, educate them on what value we're bringing into their communities, and so we really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do these types of connections. So. Start off with who we are. We were formed in 1961 by Colorado state statute. Quick history lesson, back in the early part of the 20th century, people started moving to the metro area. A lot of population, a lot of industry, a lot of business, and no cohesive plan to deal with sewage, to deal with wastewater. And the South Platte River and its tributaries, Bear Creek, Clear Creek, Cherry Creek, became, in essence, open sewers. And it was a public health crisis that was a pretty serious issue, especially aggravated by the fact that there's not a lot of water in Colorado. In other places, some of that water can be washed out and rolled into other larger water bodies. But here it became a difficult thing to manage. And so some really far-thinking people in the late 50s and 60s got together and said, we can manage this together as a region better than we can do it individually. We can pool resources. And really the proof is in the pudding. In the last 50, 60 years, the Platte and the rivers in this area have been cleaned up. Public health has improved dramatically. Property values have improved. And it's been a regional experiment that's worked really well. Lakewood joined in 1964 through one of its then sanitation districts. And then, now, of course, is one of our fundamental members of the district. We've got 2 treatment facilities, one in Commerce City, the Height facility, which is our big facility, was built in the late 60s, and we have a facility in Brighton now. It's called our Northern Treatment Facility. 38-member board of directors managing 2 million people, about 715 square miles of service area. And those directors come from our 22-member municipalities, basically the Metro Denver area, kind of south of Boulder and north of Douglas County for the most part, most of that area. The member municipalities send us 38 board members, so I manage to work with 38 community members every month on a frequent basis, and that's a really great opportunity for us. And then we've got 27 what we call special connectors and 12 connectors to connectors as well. We manage about 400 employees to do this work, and as I said, we've got 2 treatment facilities. So we managed to collect and treat most of the wastewater in the metro area. So what we have, just a sort of a 101 on wastewater, is the 2 parts of a system. One's called the transmission system, brings the wastewater to the facilities, and one is the treatment system. Our transmission system is made up of what we call interceptors. The local communities manage the local pipes. The laterals to the homes go into streets, which are usually managed by our member municipalities. Those streets move the wastewater to connecting interceptor pipes. Lakewood's pipes, interceptors are the Lakewood Gulch and the Lakewood Gulch Common interceptors. The amount of flow we get from Lakewood is about our 5th largest connector in the metro area, so it's a large connector for us. And we manage, along with those interceptors, about 240 miles worth of pipes and facilities around the metro area. As Jay mentioned, we're a sanitary sewer entity. We don't collect stormwater. Sometimes, incidental stormwater makes its way into the system, but for reasons mandated by the EPA and really good practice in wastewater treatment, it's a better system if it's separated, so we are continued to be separated. Another thing we have sort of outside of the walls of the treatment center is our pre-treatment program. So we are delegated by the municipalities to regulate industry and what they discharge into the sanitary sewer systems. We work with industry really closely. We create permits for them, make sure they're not discharging hazardous or dangerous substances into the system. And our industrial partners, who are the businesses who are here in the metro area, are fantastic partners. We have a program that is really great and very successful, and we're really proud of that, and we're proud of all the work the industrial partners do. The next part of the process, once we collect that wastewater, it goes into the treatment process, and as I said, we have 2 treatment plants. The schematic we have up here is a very rough kind of diagram of how it works when it gets to the plant. The first part of the, number 1 and 2 of the diagram there, what first happens when the interceptors collect together, come to the plant, we have a screening process. It takes out large kind of physical objects, trash, things that can foul up the works down the path there. Those are cleaned, screened, and taken off the landfills. Then goes through a grit removal, which helps us remove dirt and grit out of the systems. And then it moves into what's called a primary clarification process. At that process, grease and oils kind of rise to the top, solids go to the bottom, and that's where we start really 2 separate trains, the solid treatment train and the liquid treatment train. The liquid treatment train is the blue arrows you see up there. It'll go from the clarification process to what we call biological nutrient removal, where the wastewater is passed over biological, basically bugs that eat the organic material. It kind of mimics what happens in a river or natural processes to clean water. And after it goes through that process, it goes into another clarification process where solids again settle. And finally, it goes into a disinfection process where we put, in our case, peracetic acid to kill pathogens and any of the sort of remaining dangerous stuff that's in the wastewater at that point. At this point, it's almost clean effluent, and after it's disinfected, that effluent is discharged into the Platte River. And it's discharged under the terms of a state-issued discharge permit. The CDPHE issues a permit for us that requires very low amounts of nutrients and other harmful constituents in the wastewater, and that effluent goes into the river, and it's used not too far downstream for drinking water from some drinking water constituents who they further process it. It's used for recreational purposes. Obviously, there are fish in the river. Farms downstream use it. So it is treated effluent. It goes into the Platte pursuant to discharge. The solid process, which is the sort of the black lines, those solids are pumped into a system that's called anaerobic digestion. It's a heated system that, again, reacts chemically with the organics in the solids, and actually that chemical reaction creates methane gas, which we convert to electricity and run between 35 and 40% of our plant electricity is created literally by our process. And then the solids are processed further, and water is drained and spun out in centrifuges, and it becomes a product called biosolids, which is a soil amendment that's used in farms. And the biosolids that we produce, 35% of them that we take to a farm that we own out in Deer Trail, which is a 52,000 acre farm. We grow wheat out there, and we use this soil amendment out there. And then the other 65% is applied with farmers that we have contracts with out in eastern Colorado. And there's a line a mile long to get this product. It's a very effective product. It adds nutrients to the soil, and it's very popular with the farming community out there. We also, as I said, we generate energy. About 35–40% of our energy that we need to run our plant is generated through the process itself. And all of this work is done under federal regulation and federal code. So it's a process where we try to extract as many resources out of the wastewater as we can and use them beneficially for the community, and also use them to reduce our rates and lower our costs. This is just an example, this slide here, which is what we have to do with the water stream and how we're reducing nutrients in the water. So phosphorus and nitrogen, when they're in large collections in water streams, can pose health problems and environmental problems for watersheds. And so we've been working with the state to substantially lower the amount of phosphorus and the amount of nitrogen and other nutrients that are in the stream, but also to do it with the rates and with our ratepayer costs in mind, because science and technology is out there that allows you to lower these limits to very, very low, but the lower you get, the higher exponentially the costs get. And there has to be a balancing between what's safe and permissible for public health, and also what can literally almost bankrupt communities. And some communities in the East Coast have dealt with this and had really difficult financial results as a result of the program. So what we've done is negotiate with the state to get lower nutrient levels than they're asking for now, so even safer than they need to be, but buy us more time to get to the very low levels. And I think with technology and innovation, which is something we really champion at the district, we'll be able to do that and not have to raise our rates and keep the river really clean. So we've got a lot of smart people working on that, but this is just an example of the amount of nutrients that are being reduced as part of this work that we do. So the question that most of our connectors really want to talk about, and rightfully so, is how we pay for this and where the money goes. Just to give you an idea of the size of our operation, in 2018, our operating budget numbers were 80 million. Capital expenditures were just south of 100 million, paying about 45 million in debt service for some bonds we floated to do some capital work. On the revenue side, we collected about $64 million in sewer connection fees. About $1 million of those came from Lakewood. Those connection fees have been going up almost every year, but we see them flattening out a little bit as development slows down. And then we get annual charges for service, which each of our members pay an amount of $129 million, and about $3 million of that comes from Lakewood. What we've got coming up is about $1 billion in capital construction in the next 10 years. That's to keep up with the regulation changes and basically lowering limits, what we have to take out of the wastewater stream, and fixed asset replacements. So we have a lot of older buildings that were built in the 60s and 70s, so that's part of what we're dealing with going forward. The stuff that's really, really neat, though, is what's coming in front of us, and I think this is part of why the board wanted us to get out and talk to people about why we're here and what the value of what our entity does for communities. A really interesting fact, this first bullet is called intensification, is that over the last 25 or 30 years, the population of the metro area, as we all know, has expanded significantly. And yet we see virtually the same amount of hydraulic flow at the plant as we did in 1970, which is really interesting. Water use has not gone up a lot because of the measures that we've all taken in water conservation. But what that does, though, is it highly intensifies what we get. It's thicker, it's got more stuff in it. It requires a lot different science to manage. And we have a very geographically tight footprint in Commerce City. We can't get any bigger where we are. And so we are trying to build things that are smarter, stacked up on top of each other, and managing to handle this higher biological demand load that we get. It's really interesting stuff, but what it does is it drives innovation. And we've come up with some stuff that's being nationally recognized as far as limited land and higher intensity wastewater in terms of constituents. The second bullet on here is something called heat recovery. And this is a fascinating thing we've been working on. In the interceptor pipes, the sewage is hot. And the reason it's hot is because people take hot showers, they run their dishwashers, there's hot water in that system and it retains its heat. We have to lower the temperature of our effluent because the state says what we put back in the river is a little too hot for aquatic life to live. The typical way to do that is to build cooling towers, which are incredibly expensive, cost a ton of money to maintain, and waste energy. I mean, for lack of a better term, it's literally what they do. So what we've looked at doing is actually extracting heat from the interceptors. That heat can be used to literally heat and cool neighborhoods. And it lowers our effluent temperature. And we're doing it right now in a partnership with the National Western Center. They're going to extract 4 megawatts of heat out of one of our interceptor pipes. It's completely clean, it's completely sustainable, it comes every day and it never stops coming. So that being part of things like that with the smart people that we work with is a really neat opportunity. And we have interceptors all over the city where developers or our city connectors and members will be able to take advantage of that because we need to drop the temperature down another couple degrees. So the third bullet on here is just kind of an interesting thing we think about a lot. I think the state thinks about a lot is water and energy have an incredible nexus. The water industry is basically the largest user of energy in the state, and the energy business is basically the largest user of water in the state. And so when we work to lower our energy demand, it lowers water demand for the energy companies. And we're doing a lot of work with energy providers to talk about things we can do with what we produce, energy we produce on site that we can export, and ways we can look to lower both those demands, because every time you do that, that just means more water for people to use in the state, which is, ultimately the goal. And so it's a really a great opportunity for us to explore. And it's one of the things I mentioned when we talk to our connectors, because a lot of our connectors have ideas in that area. So I just think it's always something neat to bring up. And that kind of is the point of the last bullet, is that what we really want to look to do is be partners with some of these things we got to solve going forward. We used to think of ourselves as a sewer treatment plant at the end of the river, and we didn't talk to anybody. But where we sit is literally in the middle of the water cycle. It comes to us, it goes back, it gets used again over and over and over. And so people have to know what we do, and we have to know what everyone else is doing so we can get involved in these opportunities. So that's just a quick overview of who we are and what we do. I would be more than happy to answer questions, and I really, really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So we'll start with a few questions or comments. It's great to have you out. I'm not sure we've had a presentation in a long time, so this is really a great opportunity. So I much appreciate that.
Thank you.
I did see that your capital outlay is about $89 million a year, and your 10-year need is $1 billion. So you have somewhat of a delta over the next 10 years. Is that going to be made up through rate increases, new development, things like that, or how do you close that gap?
We're scheduled to spend, there are some years where we're scheduled to spend a little more than $100 million a year, and those are related specifically to projects that are relatively near term. Our rate projections at this point have us going out at least over the next couple of years at between a 2% and 3% rate increase. And we're striving actively to keep that level of rate increase throughout, the capital expenditure period if possible. The wild card are the connection fees. At $64 million this year, it was about $10 million more than we expected, which is great, and that helps us level some of those rates in the near term. But if that drops significantly, if there's a real drop in development, some of the out years in our rate projections start to go up a little bit.
Okay. And then the next question I have, and it's something I think that you've dealt with for a long time, and you're able to probably pull a lot of things out of the water, but there were some studies and there were concerns about medication, prescription pills being flushed, and issues of fowl and other fish, aquatic life downstream. How is that situation?
That is first of all, it's a great question, something our industry, our sector grapples with all the time. The big answer is it's a lot easier to keep it out of the system than to get it out once it gets to us. Chemically speaking, it's a challenge. Most of these medicines, for the most part, most of them break down either in the process on the way to the plant or not by intention at what we do, but because of what we do. But not all of them. And there are a number of emerging contaminants out there. You may have heard of PFAS and some of these other things, and some of the issues that we're seeing with T-norm, which is naturally forming radiation, and with pharmaceuticals that are, like I say, they're not suited for wastewater removal. That doesn't mean our industry isn't constantly trying to keep on top of that. But I think as community leaders, it's important for us to recognize that getting people to stop putting that stuff into the water system is by far the best defense. But we have had some advances on detecting this stuff. We've had some advancements on trying to isolate certain chemicals and certain elements of these contaminants. But it's a moving target. I will say that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that lends itself to when we do drug takebacks. We do them for a lot of reasons, but this is another important reason to communicate to the community. Don't flush those down the toilet. And yep. Thank you. Mr. Roybal.
Thank you, Mayor. I love your presentation and how the system really comes around. And I wanted to talk a little bit about your solid waste and how that came around and how you took all your excess stuff and you grinded it down. And in essence, I'm not going to call it fertilizer, but I'll just say some nutrients for the, back to the farmers. My question is, now that it's been so successful, and here in Lakewood, I got to tell you, we incorporated in 1969, but before that, back in the 50s, this was a farming area. And we still have a lot of folks that, even though we have acres that they want to farm on, and they would be excited to explore the opportunity to see if some of your product would be available.
Absolutely. We will not turn anyone away who wants to use we do 95 tons of this stuff a day.
Wow.
Never stops coming, so we're always looking for customers.
Well, that's a possibility. I mean, I just want to put it out there.
Yeah.
And then the next question I have for you is that you talked about, going through your pipes and your system, and the bacteria gets, really hot. And in turn that you wanted to cool it down, and you talked about the thermals coming back. Is there any possibility where, and this is just maybe something in the future that we can kind of look at, is maybe the city utilizing some of that heat for their commercial buildings here?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, that district level of heating is exactly what these types of systems are designed to do. The key is sort of a geographic key. There are points in the system that are hotter than other points. And you've got to have the heat at a certain level for it to make economic sense to build the system. And I'd have to look at like the Lakewood Gulch interceptors and see where they sit and what the temperature map looks like. But yeah, the short answer is yes, that's exactly what this can be designed to do and is doing at the National Western Center.
I'd be interested in getting more information on that.
Absolutely.
So that's all I have, Mayor.
Thank you. Good questions. Mr. Beta?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. This is a fascinating subject for me, and it's one that I think most of us take for granted, the service that you provide. You write your little fee to the district every month, and you flush your toilet, and I forget all about it, right? But what a tremendous, thing this is for a service for us. And but I did have just a couple of questions. In terms of your current existing infrastructure, where would you say you're at in terms of your capacity? As you said, right now, where are you at in terms of how much you can handle? Maybe as a percentage.
Right. So we just finished our every 5 years we do what we call a facility planning effort. That one of the major things we look at is our hydraulic and our organic capacity, because the hydraulic capacity is how much water we can take and handle. The organic capacity was kind of what I was referring to before. This stuff is sort of thicker now, right? We are probably at the 70% level on hydraulic capacity, and we think we're well situated there. But for the first time ever, we've gone over 80% on our biological capacity, which is really interesting. That triggers a planning requirement under the permit requirements, and we're doing that planning right now. So we are getting closer to that. Now, we built a plant up in the northern area in Brighton, which will take some of the flows that had gone to our Height plant and up there, and that'll relieve some capacity issues we have. But long term, what we're going to have to do to resolve this, I think, is one of two things. One, intensify processes at Height, which include kind of building up rather than out. And two is look at opportunities to locally treat wastewater. And what I mean by that is that, we have wastewater in our pipes that could be used in small, the technology is moving so fast, small innovative treatment areas that you could take out essentially purple water right out of that. Be very safe. You could use it for watering lawns. You could be using it for other, industrial uses. And that actually will save some of our capacity problems as well. So that's the kind of things we're thinking about going forward. Because what we don't want to do is invest another $1 billion in building a plant. And we want to try, because that's what really cripples your rates, is that level of capital investment all at one time, as you guys know, your projects. So.
And just as a follow-up, so do you have a process where you have communications and conversations with the various municipalities around the area that you serve in terms of your capacity and what the effect of our the growth that we've experienced and continue to experience? Do you have any conversations about that, about how that affects and, your services and your ability to continue to provide service? Or is it just kind of everybody does their own thing and you just try to keep up with it the best you can?
We have annual discussions through a survey that we issue, and then we have particular discussions with areas where we see a lot of growth. Some places like Aurora has a lot of territory and a lot of potential for growth. So we're in a lot of contact with Aurora about what they're planning. It informs our planning efforts. So we do try to incorporate as much information as we can get about major potential for growth because, it affects how we plan. And that's, in Colorado, that's just seems to be a never-ending topic. So it's really important.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. Mickey, that was fascinating. Thank you. I do have a couple questions. You said that you use a sanitizing process to kill the pathogens. Does that also include viruses?
Well, I think viruses can be eliminated as part of our disinfection process. They do, yeah. So peracetic acid is what we use. We used to use chlorine, but now we use peracetic acid. So what the effect of using the peracetic acid is to lower certain counts of pathogens like, I'm trying to think of like the crazy ones, but the easy ones are
E. coli.
And those are the major counts we do. So the effect of the peracetic acid is that it kills most of that type of pathogen bugs. So I'm not an expert in that area, and we switched from chlorine to peracetic acid last year. We were one of the first people to do it in the country, so I'd have to get you an answer on what exactly it targets, but it's all basically reflective of what our permit limits are at that point.
Thank you. The fluid that you put into the South Platte, is it drinkable?
I wouldn't drink it. And I don't say that lightly. I just think it's not potable water. It's not cleaned to a drinking water standard. It's cleaned to an effluent standard, which the state, issues a permit for. And it's actually cleaner even than what the permit requires, but it's not intended to be drinking water. It is used, although just downstream by Thornton and Aurora in their processes as drinking water, but it goes through another
level of sanitizing.
Flock head process, basically, yeah.
Okay. Is there anything that you need from Lakewood to make your life easier or that we should help with in any way?
Just board members like Jerry and Mark. I mean, honestly, people who care about their communities and care enough to learn about what we do and become informed board members, that just makes all the difference for us. So we're really fortunate.
Good, thank you.
Mr. Abel?
I'd just like to note that a lot of the things you folks do, the public never knows about. After the Buffalo Creek fire 20 years ago or so, the ground was hydrophobic, and Metro Wastewater took on the project of reclaiming an entire hillside as kind of a can we do it situation, and y'all did darn well with it. So a lot of things y'all do that benefit the community as a whole is never seen, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else? Mr. Hunter, do you want to say anything or?
I think we're in a good position right now.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Very, very informative. We appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. Thanks, Jay.
You're welcome to stick around.
Madam Clerk. Item.
Item 4, presentation, street and pedestrian lighting information and discussion.
Mr. Hutchinson's evening tonight.
Merely as the introducer, thank you again, Mayor, City Council, Jay Hutchison, Director of Public Works. And I am going to also introduce this item with a bit longer introduction than the preceding ones. It's one that ultimately what we're looking forward to is your questions, your comments, your desires, whatever we hear from the public this evening and ongoing. And it has to do with lighting of streets and paths. And I want to distinguish that from traffic signals. This is illumination lighting, not the red, green, and yellow. This is, well, although this slide has colors, as you'll hear pretty soon, but it's not the red, green, and yellow traffic lights, traffic signals. The city does have a policy today that's been in place for a number of years related to street lighting. The city does not have a policy on path lighting. Independent paths are a little bit newer. They're getting a lot more attention and use, and so we thought we'd talk about both this evening a little bit. The other driver to bring us here tonight is the evolution of several things. One is technology. As you all know, lighting technology has been changing over the years, and this seems to be a good time to talk about it. Community desires have also been evolving, not always consistently, which is no surprise to those of you in your seats, but certainly that has been evolving and changing as well. And interestingly, even medical knowledge has changed in a way that is going to affect this topic a bit. Perhaps I should first talk a little bit about several different areas of lighting and to try to frame what this topic really is going to include, because it includes some things, it does not include some things that are probably more ripe for another day, and it also isn't an instant change no matter what the decisions ultimately become. So let me talk about 5 different areas. First are new streets or new paths. Clearly, a new policy would affect what happens along those. That's the simple circumstance. It's the one that happens with land development routinely. But you also know that this is a community that's primarily already developed, so it won't have a large effect in a short period of time. But it's one aspect of what we'll talk about this evening. The second are paths. As I mentioned earlier, there's not a lighting policy on paths. We've done some lighting on paths to kind of test some things, but that area also is clearly a part of this discussion. The third is those locations where streets have to be modified in such a way that the street lights have to come down. And let me give you 3 examples. One is Wadsworth between 14th and Highland Drive. When CDOT widened that roadway, all the street lights had to come out because they were too close to the existing roadway to still serve the new roadway. Once they come out, there's a choice that can be made about where are they put, what types of lights are they, who owns the lights, those kinds of things. And some decisions have been made, and I'll come back to that here in just a second. A second example is a city project, and that's Alameda in front of Belmar, where the widening there required some lights to be taken out, and those also were completely replaced. So there was that decision point when the lights came out of what do we do for the future. The third example that I'll use is with traffic signal reconstruction. Most traffic signals have 2 or 4 lights mounted actually on the signal poles to light the intersection area. So whenever one of those signals is rebuilt, we have the same opportunity. We've taken out lights. Let's make some good decisions about what to do for the future. In all 3 of those instances, the lighting that's going in are city-owned lights as opposed to XL-owned lights, and they're light-emitting diodes, so they're lower energy consumption lights as well. We don't have those opportunities often or in a large percentage way across the 8,000 lights or so in the city of Lakewood, but we try to take advantage of that when it makes sense. So that's the third area, and that could be addressed by the policy as well, because we'll still have projects occasionally that cause the removal of street lights, and there's a decision to be made, so that seems like fodder for a policy discussion also. The fourth area, also I think ripe for this discussion, is requests for additional lights or removal of lights, and we get both. And this would be, one way to think of this might be, if you choose to, is to have a baseline, a generally applicable policy, but then a methodology to add additional lights in some circumstances or to remove lights in other circumstances. So that's clearly a piece of the puzzle that could be part of this discussion. So all of those seem to fit nicely in this policy discussion about street lighting and path lighting in a community that's mostly already lit and it's mostly a retrofit situation. The last one I want to talk about probably doesn't fit quite as well. It's certainly an important topic, and it has actually 2 parts. One is the conversion to LEDs or some other energy efficient lighting, who knows what might be next, of the existing 7,700 or so lights that are generally high pressure sodium, much more energy consuming lights than LEDs. Related to that is the ownership of lighting. Some communities have taken a different path and have pursued separate or different ownership of the street lights in the community. Neither of those topics really, I think, fit well in this policy discussion of dealing with lighting as opportunities show up. It's certainly an important topic and one that will come up in time, but it's probably not one that fits well in this discussion. And part of that is that this policy is primarily a prospective policy. What do we do in the future, whether we add streets, change streets, have the opportunity when lights come out, as opposed to what do we do with the existing lighting system in general? That's really the distinction that I'm trying to make. Tonight, you're going to hear background information, much of which was addressed in the staff memorandum that you've received and has been publicly available for some time. But about a lot of different topics. And we're not here to recommend specific answers to those. So this, unfortunately or fortunately, may be a fairly messy discussion, which is fine. And that's what we're looking for, is to understand what you have questions about. We'll answer what we can, obviously, tonight, but we may need to come back with additional information. And also to see what your interests are so that we can pursue what the City Council would like in a policy that we could draft after this evening's discussion. Which would be the next step, is to draft some kind of an initial cut at a policy and to come back to the City Council for your consideration of that. With that, I will introduce someone who knows more about this than I do. Mike Whitaker is here. He's the city's transportation engineer, and he's had experience in lighting in a variety of different spheres, not just at the City of Lakewood, but in some other roles as well. He will walk through all of these different topics that are associated with this kind of lighting, and then we'll look forward to your questions and comments. Great. Thank you all.
Thank you. Mr. Whitaker, good evening. Welcome.
Good evening, Mayor and members of the council. I apologize up front. This is what seems to be an easy topic, but hopefully you will get some background knowledge that will help make some of the sense of some headlines you've been hearing. So start off, as Jay mentioned, we do have an existing policy. Arterial streets, which would be like the Jewels, Alamedas. Our policy right now says a 250 watt light alternating at about 150 foot spacing down the road. Every intersection would have 2 lights. And then when you go down to a next class of road, like a collector, like a Garrison or a West 10th, you know, it basically uses that same 250 watt light and just says it alternates about 200 to 250 feet down the road, and intersections get 1 light. Our current policy for local streets basically says we do just curb, driveway, or porch lighting on the residents, and the city doesn't put any street lighting in. As Jay mentioned, we do have a little policy for adding a light to an existing local street, which currently requires a petition from the residents and the transportation engineer to determine that there's a traffic hazard that we're trying to light. So that's kind of our basis where we're starting from. To help you make a little more sense of this, hopefully, I'm going to talk about a few different concepts, talk about patterns of light, colors of light, how long the lights last, the amount of light we may want on different types of roadways and situations, some safety effects of light, typical issues, what some cities around us are doing, and then obviously we get into the discussion of some concepts for consideration. So in general, lights can be ordered with different broad categories. So if you're trying to light a narrower road, we can use a long elliptical shaped type 1 light. As the roads get wider, you have to go to a little more wider light distribution until you get all the way up to a type 5, which is essentially like a round light. Might be able to put it in a cul-de-sac or a traffic circle or something. So one of the first things we do is in a lighting design is to try to figure out what do we actually want to light. And so we can order these lights, for different width roads because they'll distribute the light differently. They're not all just the same light anymore. They're pretty customized into different groups. So if we have a 7-lane road, we'd use a different fixture than if we're doing a bike path because the situation, what we're trying to light is different. So that's kind of a fundamental concept is these lights are ordered and they put out the same amount of light. So as the mounting height changes, that same amount of light is going to be distributed over a bigger area. So the higher the pole, the more it'll cast light. Conversely, if you had a 40-foot pole and you change to a 20-foot pole, you're going to need essentially twice as many lights to cover the same area because you've changed that casting pattern. So how do we figure out with all these variables what's going on? Well, most of the companies now actually test their lights and measure their light coming out of those light fixtures. And they provide us a computer file that quantifies how much light's coming out at different angles. So we have software now, like most things in life anymore. We can take those files and put them into a model. And so we can say how many lanes on a street we have, how big the planter strip is, how wide the sidewalk is, and create a design area and put these lights in at different spacings, different heights, and see what works out best, kind of cost effectively, and compare different types of lights together to come up with an overall design. So kind of the traditional design from Excel is you're basically, they have 2 different types of lights you have to choose from, and you're kind of working with those patterns. Well, with the advent of technology and the LEDs, you can actually get those lights to be better suited for that particular type of facility you're trying to do. Like Jace talked about, if we have a bike path, it's going to be a totally different light than if we're trying to light Alameda. So one of the ways they do this is the diode emits light out and they can change the lenses and how much light's there, and so it refracts it differently. So if you remember, 6th grade science class playing with prisms and refracting light, it's essentially the same concept. It's just done on every single light. The other concept we're going to get into now is the color of the light. So with lighting color, if you've been to a hardware store, you've probably seen this, but we kind of call it the color temperature range, and it's usually measured in Kelvin. So you can see a clear blue sky is about 10,000 Kelvin. Mercury vapor lights, metal halide lights are in the 4,000 to 6,000. Moonlight's about 4,000. High pressure sodium, which is our current lighting stock for the most part, is down around 2,200. You can see that's, really orange, a little bit of yellow. When you go to the hardware store, they've kind of categorized them into daylight, cool white, warm white. The same thing is still that color temperature that we use with LEDs. But this is where we start getting into some needs for the light. So when you start talking about safety and some other effects, you notice that if you're in the daylight, you're going to get a bluish tint to anything that's white or green. If you're more in the 3,500 to 4,000 mid-range there, the colors actually, for the human eye, look like what they're supposed to be. But under the high pressure sodium down at the bottom, you know, if you're wearing a blue jacket under high pressure sodium, it's going to appear black. If you're wearing a white shirt, it's going to appear orange. And so that's where the police department has a lot of issues in some areas with some safety reports and that stuff, and trying to find the people they're looking for, because the lighting is affecting what people are saying they were wearing. So it does have an effect. Now, in reality, it's not just one wavelength of light. You know, light's a conglomeration of a bunch of different wavelengths. So on the top chart there is a high pressure sodium. You can see the yellows and oranges are the predominant amount of waves, but there are some blues in there. In the lower is the same distribution a little bit. You'll notice there's a blue spike. Most of that with LEDs now, they use a blue diode to create the light, and then they push that blue light through some luminescent layers that create the other ranges of light. And so that blue light's more intense because that's what the diode emits. And then we customize it with different layers to get the light to look, you know, bright blue or warm or different color temps. So the better manufacturers are actually trying to reduce that blue light, because if you've heard some headlines, you know, blue light affects your circadian rhythms, and that's kind of how humans have evolved. You know, we're used to that sunlight in the morning kind of waking the body up. Then you get to the sunsets, you get those orange and red wavelengths that are predominant. It's kind of signaling your body it's time to start shutting down and getting ready for sleep and starting to produce some melatonin. So electricity has really kind of changed the way we sleep. As it mentions here, you know, light at night from your tablets, your iPhones, even the compact fluorescent lights, you know, those are bad for you trying to go to sleep, and you've probably heard a lot of headlines about that. One of the major ones in our industry for street lighting, the American Medical Association came out with some studies saying that we should be at 3,000 K or below, which isn't that different from where we're at with high pressure sodium, is about 2,200. But it's not very good color rendition where police and safety are looking for. Since then, you know, the lighting industry and manufacturers have kind of gone back and forth with the American Medical Association, and they've realized that the color temp isn't the correct rendition or what is in the biggest effect. It's the amount of that blue light, and that's why the better manufacturers are really trying to reduce that amount of blue light in any fixture we use. The next lighting concept is the life of the light. So a light fixture puts out a certain amount of energy at the start, and it degrades over time. So that first curve, you can just kind of see it looks like a half circle, is kind of a standard high pressure sodium street light. It starts out at 100% of its energy, and within about 5 years, 50% of the lights have burned out. And it's down to about 70% of the energy or the lights that it's put out has gone away in that 5 years. Well, if you look at the green line up there, LED street lights don't degrade near as fast. When I first started, they were talking, you know, about 10 years, then it went to 15. Now there's some companies saying that it's going to be more like 20 years before they get to that 70% reduction. That 70% reduction is just kind of a set thing that streeting designers for lighting have used. We design for end of life. We want to make sure at the end of the life, whenever we're going to replace a light, that there's enough light in that facility. And so what that really happens is on day one, we're 30% too bright. And it takes the life of that fixture to get to where we really wanted it to be. So we've wasted a lot of energy and a lot of impact with being too bright for, if we go with LEDs, you know, for 15 years or so. So there's technology has kind of come out with that stuff too, where we can put controls in where we can dim the lights. There's different systems out there that the new street lights allow you to do. Obviously there's costs, and you have to look at the cost benefit. But industry's kind of responding to that as well. Next concept is the amount of light. So there's two main professional organizations that are trying to guide the amount of lighting that is happening in the public space. The first one is the Illuminating Engineering Society. It used to be called of North America. They've dropped to North America, and they're trying to become more worldwide. And they have a recommended practice, currently number 8, for how much light would be on a certain facility or a parking lot or in tunnels, sidewalks, paths, that stuff. And then there's a competing organization called the International Commission on Illumination. It's mostly European-based, and they basically do the same thing, and the recommendations are fairly close to each other, but they are a little bit different in some aspects. The one I'm most familiar with is IES, being it was kind of the North American standard. So the basic concept in IES is you take, once again, that street class, whether it's an arterial, and it'll say, we need this much light based on what your pedestrian activity is. If you're Alameda in front of Belmar, we've got a lot of pedestrians, they want more light than if you're out by Green Mountain and there's not as many peds, although depending on the recreation time, there could be a lot of peds out there too. So it kind of varies based on your roadway class and the pedestrian conflict level. And that's how they do it. And also some standards for uniformity, which you'll hear me talk a little bit about. And that's essentially how the light's distributed over the area from dark to minimum. You know, you've probably all driven down roads where we've got a nice bright pool of light under a light, and then you go a little bit and you see a dark streak. And I call it kind of the tiger aspect as you drive down a road where you go from light to dark, light to dark. And so it's not very uniform. A better uniform design, it would be more, what I call uniform, but more gradual. You're still going to be a little brighter right under the light, but it shouldn't drop off so much as you get further away from the light. And there's also one for glare, which is when you look at a light at a low angle, how much it impacts your eye or disables your ability to see is the glare target. Pedestrians are kind of a little different animal. With roadways, we're looking at how much light lands on the surface so you can see if there's something on the road. But with pedestrians, we're trying to light up the front of the pedestrian so you can actually see the profile of the pedestrian and that. And it's not so much that you just want to see what's on the surface. So there's different levels for vertical illumination for pedestrians. Once again, it varies based on your conflict areas. And they also have some factors for what the zoning is. Is it residential? Is it rural? Is it, multifamily? Is it commercial? A concept that we get to a little bit is some underpasses and tunnels. And in that situation, you're looking more at facial recognition. You want to be able, as you're going through that tunnel where you don't have really a good escape path, to be able to see that person's expressions on their face. Are they smiling? Are they growling? And then the further you can discern that, the more safe you're going to feel. And so that's kind of the biggest topic with underpasses and tunnels. The next concept I'll touch base here on is the safety effects of light. Going to talk a little bit about some studies that have come out. Sergeant Alesh was going to be here to help us, but he had a child care issue. But the studies are around the world, actually. Some of the more prominent ones. This one was a New York housing development. New York has some really big housing projects. So they took 40 sites, they used 20 as a control group, and then they modified the lighting in 20 of them, added lights, changed them to LEDs. And they saw a 36% reduction in violent crimes, and they saw about a 4% reduction in property crimes. So it's not quite as big. The theory there being that if people are afraid you're going to be able to see them really well, you're probably less likely to do something violent, where property crimes is more of an opportunity type thing sometimes. The next study is one that was done in the city of Chicago. They had a real problem with alleys. And so they really increased the lighting in alleys in Chicago. There was a previous slide to this one that I didn't show, but it kind of shows the same violent crimes reduced in the alleys. This one's more on the property crimes. The red's pre-improvement and the blues post-improvement. What's interesting, you'll see there's not really too much significant difference in most of the crimes, other than substance abuse went way up. And so when you talk to the police officers, they're saying, you know, the addicts can see their veins when you give them better lighting. And so it was easier for them to shoot up, because in an alley, they're not as worried about being seen because there's not as much eyes on an alley as you might have on a normal street. And so it's pretty nuanced on situations where lighting can help and where it may not actually get the result you're looking for. The next study was in England and Wales, where there were 62 different agencies that were trying to conserve energy and money and some impacts. So they turned off the lights, or some agencies turned off the lights from midnight to 7 a.m. Some dimmed them, some just changed them to LED white light, a little better. The interesting thing out of this study is they said there was no correlation with crashes when they reduced the lights in these communities, which for me is a little shocking, because we usually associate lighting a roadway with about a 30% reduction in crashes at night. But these studies were saying they couldn't find any hard correlation. They also said there was no overall correlation with any increase in safety, but there were some minor correlations. So in a lower economic area, when you added light, there was less crime. When you took the light away or reduced it or dimmed it, there was actually more crime in the lower economic. But the opposite happened in higher economic areas. The crimes actually increased in higher economic areas. And the theory there being is maybe people could go buy the cars or whatever and see what was in them before they actually committed the crime. And so it kind of had an opposite effect. Part of their study, they did surveys. You know, as you would expect, 73% of people that they surveyed said that better lighting would improve their child's safety. 64% said better lighting would decrease crashes. And once again, when you looked at their roadway crash data, lighting the roadways obviously decreased it. We don't know why. They didn't find any correlation with taking the light away, why it didn't increase. But this is kind of a point that Sergeant Alesh really wanted to point out, is lighting is really about feeling for some people. You want to feel safe, and more lighting makes most people feel safer, and it might get some more people out doing stuff, which helps with the social interaction, which also helps with reducing crime. But the data doesn't always prove that out. This is kind of an interesting city of LA. Anybody who does street lighting retrofits has always seen these pictures. They changed out 147,000 street lights from HPS to LED. As Jay mentions, we have about 8,000 in Lakewood, so much bigger quantity. They did it in 3 years. It was a really aggressive project. The interesting thing is the LAPD, after it was over, kind of looked at before and after, just to see if there was any kind of change in the crime. So once again, in kind of the property crimes, they saw about 11% reduction overall. Now, this is a 3-year over the whole city of LA. And so, you know, you got to kind of worry about, you know, was lighting the only thing that changed in this time frame? But it's kind of a snapshot. Who knows if that was the only correlation. So kind of in summary, for safety, there's pretty well-known effects that if you light an area, similar to what the SEPTEB division does, you know, you're probably going to push that crime to another area that's not as well lit. But you are going to reduce the opportunity. You're trying to increase the risk of that criminal being caught by adding the light. But it does make some crimes easier, as we saw in the Chicago alley studies. As we talked, you know, the effects on the neighbors, it gets that social interaction. You might get more people out using it. The neighborhood feels better about their community, which can lead to some investment and more upkeep. People still feel safer. Kind of from the LA study, you know, even though it was a huge, wide thing, they showed some displacement occurred, but they were still showing 11% reduction. So, I mean, that's one of the few system-wide lighting improvements, and it still shows some pretty good benefits. All right, so some typical issues. On the left, we have a high-pressure sodium road. On the right, we've changed it out to an LED. You can see the crisper light, police are going to be much happier with any kind of reports that come back for color a car, color a suspect. The light level, you can see if you went out with a photo measuring device, a photometer, you'd have about the same amount of light energy on the surface, but the one on the right with the LED just looks brighter. It's just kind of the way the human eye reacts to certain wavelengths of light. Some comments we've seen in different cities that have done this, a lot of times the light's too bright. One thing you have to remember is we talked about how lights degrade over their life. So if you're taking a light that's 5, 7 years old, it's already probably putting out 50% of the light it initially did, and then you put a brand new light in, it's all the way at the top. So some of that's to be expected. Color quality. When some of the first installations went out, they were more in the 6,000 Kelvin range, and that gets that blue tint on things. And so there was a lot of stuff like, people look ghoulish. They look interesting that way. Sometimes you get light trespass because you can see better. So even though the same amount of light might be in somebody's yard or in somebody's business frontage, it's going to look brighter, and so you'll get some light trespass questions. On the flip side, a lot of people like the cleaner looking light. They feel safer in general with it. You can see better. Obviously, LED lights are everywhere, just not in municipalities. Businesses are probably leading the conversion to LED right now. Significant percentage of residents were commuting to compact fluorescence. Now when you go to the hardware store, it's hard to find an old light bulb. It's hard to find even compact fluorescence anymore. LEDs are kind of really taken over. So we're just part of the equation with the roadway and the paths. There's also the businesses and residents themselves with their housing. And that's kind of what I was trying to show here. Car dealership had 1,000 watt metal halide fixtures. They changed it out to 202 watt LEDs, so a fifth of the energy, and it actually still looks brighter. And you can go down King Soopers parking lots. There's lots of businesses that have already converted, and I don't know about you, but I haven't heard any issues from residents on most of our LED conversions. We've had a few, but for the most part, they've been pretty non-dramatic. So we're getting to the end, luckily for you. Adjacent city policies. This is mostly for adding additional lights to existing roads. So Arvada, they do 100% resident funded from the petition. Wheat Ridge has a $10,000 budget line item, which is similar to ours. And it's first come, first served, or the residents can pay for the lights themselves. They have restricted it to intersections, curves, hills, mid-blocks, at least 400 feet from another existing light. Littleton says the city pays for 100% from a resident's petition, but they say they get very few petitions in Littleton right now for additional lights. Denver also pays 100% from a resident petition, but because of the budget impacts, it's only eligible to have one light at the center of a block. So that's pretty far apart depending on how big the block is. Golden has just taken over ownership of their lights, and so they're just creating a policy now, and the city of Edgewater currently doesn't have a policy. So now we're getting to the fun stuff, ideas for consideration. So over the years that I've been here at least, the Green Mountain HOA has asked to remove every light in the neighborhood. They did it as part of their sustainability plan. I consistently get requests from what I consider Northeast Lakewood for additional lights. It's pretty common. Solterra has no street lights. That's one of the newer developments that everything is done on the resident's house. And we don't, on the local streets anyway, there's no street lights. And any other new subdivisions in the last decade or so are the same way. I've also seen where a light petition will be circulated and it fails. They won't get enough signatures. And then sometimes a burglary or a car prowl happens and that same list of residents come back in and it passes a second time. So as you can imagine, as we look at a city over decades, you know, what they may want now may not be what they want in 20 years as the economic climate changes for a certain area. So that's something we always have to keep in mind. As far as the amount of light, Seattle did a huge test for LEDs where they took different groups out at night after they changed the lights and asked them basically, is there enough light on this street? You know, what do you think of it? Did a bunch of surveys. And they kept lowering the dimming and dimming and dimming, and they got down to 50% of the light, and all the residents still said there was enough light on the road. And they didn't have a mechanism in their test to go past the 50% level because they didn't think they'd get that far. And the IES has now kind of seen the same thing, where with the new LED lights and the way the human responds to that wavelength a little bit better, that for streets that are 25 miles an hour or less, which in Lakewood aren't very many, that the light levels that they normally recommend can be reduced for 75%. So the science is slowly adapting to, as we understand the human a little bit better and what these light levels are doing, how the humans respond. So the recommendations are slowly changing as well. But that goes back to what I was talking about with uniformity, that the actual amount of light I don't think is as important as having a good lighting where it's more uniform and is really an important factor in the quality of the light. But as you guys know, lighting is a very user specific, and opinions widely vary on lighting. So here's where we show, and this is actually the same photo, even looks like we merged two in the middle. It's not. You can see on the right side the older developed neighborhood where we had a previous policy before 2007 where pretty much every intersection got a light, and then a few mid-block locations got a light as well. And on the left side of the photo, you'll see the collectors and arterial roads have lights, but all the residents don't have any lights anywhere on the local streets. And so that's kind of the change in the policy the last time. So the issue that we've dealt with a little bit is if we're putting lights out on the driveways and the porches, that frontage probably has pretty good light along that tangent of the roadway, but it makes the intersection dark because most people's porches and driveways do not go to the intersection. And if you're in one of the corner houses, you'll have a light one direction, but not the other direction. So one corner of your property will be darker. So there's a few potential policy changes we may want to change even on the local streets as you get into how houses are oriented and intersections. It is a pretty big budget item. We're currently paying $1.5 million a year in energy to Excel. And with that goes about $700,000 a year in repairing the existing lighting system. Just so you know, the average light's about $24 a month. And if it takes a new pole, it's about $5,000 to $10,000 for each new pole. Obviously, if there's an existing wood pole that we can add a light to, you know, it's in the range of hundreds of dollars instead of thousands. I just repeated the existing Lakewood street lighting policy where we're at. And then some recommendations for your consideration. You know, we'd like to focus on the outcomes, not so much on the light or the pole spacing, which I call the inputs. We want to design it for what we want, not how they should get there. We could use IES or similar recommendations. We can adjust them for Lakewood. I think one of the key aspects we need to think about is, do we want that good color rendition for commercial areas, multifamily areas, places like that, but maybe in the residential areas we drop to the 3,000 K or so that the AMA currently is, you know, saying would be better for sleep. We can publish some certain standards like we do now for certain spacings for normal sized roads, but then allow for an IES check. A good example of that is McIntyre Street south of Alameda. If we used our current process, you know, we'd have 250 watt lights about every 150 feet on the opposite side of the road. But that median out there is so wide that the light from one side of the road can't get to the other. And so we kind of switched up on that and basically treated it like two different roads. Do we light hazards? Intersections, curves, hills, mid-block crossings, speed bumps, dips, end of road, those types of things. So when I went back, we talked about pedestrian lighting. You know, we look at it as part of the overall design, and then we add supplemental, similar to like we did at some locations along Alameda or different roads, as needed. Big question, as Jay mentioned, what do we do on pedestrian paths? We don't have a policy currently. And then with paths, you have what I consider transportation paths, like the W Line Trail is a great example. But you also have transportation trails through Bear Creek Lake Park, where the main trail's essentially a transportation trail, but it's also a park. You know, and those usually are different, where parks are usually like, you know, we're closed at sunset. So we may have to have some flexibility, or definitely would like some feedback on how we want to treat what we consider transportation routes in and outside of parks. Talked a little bit about where we've had requests from like Green Mountain saying they don't want any lights in their neighborhood for sustainability. So maybe we can create lighting zones. Typically we do some other stuff to adapt to the local needs and wants. Could be by ward, could be by planning district, could be by HOA. Lots of opportunities there. Do we consider anything like park night curfews, where we turn them off certain hours? Do we dim them if we can? You know, we can use a petition process to create or change the rules if we decide we want to do different things. And then, as you probably know, with speed humps and like radar feedback signs, we usually require a petition cost share. Sometimes it's 90-10, sometimes it's 80-20. Because if we're asking for a light, you know, sometimes it's going to be a lot easier for the resident to put a light on their house or their garage to get the same outcome as whether the city puts a light out. But I know personally, if I knew somebody would put a light in for free versus me having to get an electrician or put a light on my house, might change what I asked for. So with that, we are really interested in hearing any comments from the public and your ideas. And with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Great, thank you. Nobody signed up, so any public input? All right. You know, this one's actually easy, I think, for me, and you did open up a lot of different questions that are all, you know, really well thought out. And I guess for me, one is I appreciate the presentation, and I really have a lot of faith in our staff, our public works, our police department, and our parks department to work on something. You know, you're the experts. For me personally, what I think that I've heard from the community is an opportunity to remove or to add, right? Solterra subscribes to the Dark Skies Initiative. That's worked well for them. That may work in a lot of other places. So, you know, and again, this is just me, something that you could, policy that is for removal, for adding, something that does deal with what we've heard from in Ward 2, especially on the transit type paths for safety and for flow of folks walking or biking, and then being able to delineate between a park path versus more of that transit type of path. And other than that, again, I have great faith in you all to really know what the right things are, or to bring us something that we could then look at and further bring forward. So it's my 2 cents. Ms. Harrison?
I'm sorry. It's going to stay on if I keep hitting the green light here. Excellent presentation. I really enjoyed that, learning all of that. One thing, I agree with Mayor Paul in terms of staff knows this better about the safety. 2 things that I would want to make sure of is that the CAT team is always involved in this, because there are areas that they're working around and through that probably needs more light rather than less. But also in neighborhoods where there might be elderly with macular degeneration, the minute we cut the light down, we basically lock them in their homes until the sun comes up. So that would be my only concern about reducing. If we were going to allow an HOA to make that determination, they need, or a neighborhood, they just need to make sure that they get the information out to everybody. I know that process will be handled, but that's the thing that came across my mind.
Ms. Vincent?
Yes, thank you. I know some people are very well aware that I've had a lot of concerns over these. I'm curious, though. I know the questions that I get representing the Northeast section. Have you had predominant reasons for requests in that area? Do they vary? Can you give me a little bit more information about that?
Most of them are what I would categorize as safety related.
Okay.
And so then with our existing policy, then it comes down to, is there a hazard there? So some cases there are, whether it be a cul-de-sac or a curve in the road, but a lot of times it's more, personal safety. There was a burglary next door in their house, and a recent one was some open space across the street was open, and there were some people, whether they were camping or just staying longer than they should doing stuff. They were hoping light would push them somewhere else.
Okay, because that's what I've heard. I've heard two predominant things in the older section of Lakewood, and one is directly related to, of course, the W line, the RTD, the whole safety thing around that. You just get the light right there at the rail station, and not really. It's not comfortable for people to walk back and forth. Yet we advocate that that's what we want, is people to be able to walk to public transportation. Yet they don't feel comfortable, so they don't do it. They drive the 3 or 4 blocks. The other thing is I thought it was interesting what I've heard, and I'd kind of like some recommendations back on that, is you have a lot of corners. I call them old corners there. So the lights do face, if they have a street light or a house light, it faces one area out, but there's nothing there then on, I think they're probably local arterials. So you have very, very dark areas as you progress. And I think it's probably related to this old policy of only having so many per hundreds of feet. So you literally have 3 or 4 blocks at times that don't have any lights. And just for consideration too, one thing that I think would be very important in this is to make sure that it's flexible. I know that there were some folks who really wanted LED lights or different lights when, for instance, when the light rail came in and they were told no, they couldn't have them because it wasn't in the policy. So they reestablished the old lights. So that's it. And thank you for the presentation. I appreciate it.
Okay. Mr. Abel?
In my neighborhood, when a street light goes out, about half the people cheer and the other half complain. The whole picture is kind of like that. In my neighborhood, we have houses that are 175 feet from the curb. And on the side streets, we have houses that are 50 feet from the curb. And street lighting affects those two kinds of properties much differently. So because of all of those vagaries, I guess you could say, I would gladly let staff handle these problems rather than having us suggest a fix for every other block.
Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. I would agree with a few of the other speakers. I really support your expertise in this for the most part. I personally like the petition process because I think that puts the people themselves in control of the way they want the lighting in their own neighborhood. The D10 bike path has been in play, and there was interest in having lights that seemed like, to me, high poles. When you were talking, you mentioned lighting that is more conducive to sleep or having dimmers. Is that on the agenda for that particular area if the D10 goes through?
The lights that we showed people was a 4,000 K light, I believe, might have been 3,500. So it's kind of in that range that it represents the colors well, because most of the comments I heard were more about safety in that area. But the way that fixture was oriented, so it's casting light away from the houses towards the light rail track, was kind of to address that issue of how much it impacts the residents. It took a long time to find a fixture that kind of met most of the requirements for that path, where they didn't want to see any of the glare from the fixtures. We wanted them oriented away. And so that's why I know you've seen it, it's kind of a interesting looking light architecturally.
Would there be any consideration of the color, though?
We could, I mean.
Yeah, okay. And just out of curiosity, I know that you're orienting the lights away from the immediate adjacent homes. What does that do for the homes south of the light rail? Does that have much impact on them, or do you have any idea?
Didn't have too much. I mean, just like you can see a light bulb, from blocks and blocks away now, measuring the lights, you're not going to be able to show that there's any additional light, but your eye is going to pick it up. That light, if you remember, everything's kind of recessed up into a socket. And so we tried the best we could to minimize any impacts to anybody around there. The biggest impact as far as light will actually be the path users as they get closer to that light versus people either on the house side or what we call the street side.
Like Charlie, the light went out on our street a few years ago. I was thrilled, but I'm not sure everybody up and down the street felt that way. So you're right, it's kind of, and it was interesting when you were talking about the LED. When you see Christmas lights, the ones that are the older ones look like candles, and they're a yellower tint, and to me they're a softer, more traditional light. The new LEDs do have a ghoulish look. I never thought of that word, but it takes a little bit to get used to that type of lighting. And then I do have a question. When Green Mountain decided to remove the lights, was there any kind of follow-up study regarding any crime activity? Did it impact that, or?
We actually didn't remove the lights. They put in a request, but we said we don't have a city policy to do that yet. And so we've basically put them off until this discussion and the new policy to see if we want to enable that type of response from a request. So they're still exactly the way it was.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Beta?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. One thing I would say to you that I have learned on my year and a half on council is this: when it comes to Lakewood, one size does not fit all. So whatever we do, keep that in mind. I do like the idea of some flexibility, for different neighborhoods and so forth, so that people have some say-so in what goes on. I would also say to you, whatever we do going forward, safety, I think it goes without saying, safety should be one of the paramount considerations. I also agree with the comments that, we have to rely on your expertise. This is a very technical area. It's also, from what you told us, a changing area. It's constantly evolving and so forth, the technology. So that's where we have to rely on you to keep us up to date on all the developments. I had just one quick question. With these LED lights that that we're learning and experimenting with, do they make any difference as far as these smartphones? People are out there on the street, and they take a lot of videos and pictures, of, let's say, crime scenes, for example. Does the difference in lighting make any difference as far as the quality of the pictures that are submitted, let's say, to law enforcement to help them solve a crime? You know what I'm saying? Does it have any effect on the quality of the pictures?
There is some effect. Obviously, what we call the traditional LED light's going to be a little crisper, and so the picture's going to be a little brighter looking. LEDs are interesting. They put out a lot of heat, which is one of the things manufacturers have to deal with. One of the ways they do it is they pulse on and off. And so your human eye doesn't recognize that the light's turning on and off. But if you look at it through the phone sometimes, if you look at like a headlight in a car, you'll see it looks like it's strobing. So, I mean, there are some different effects that happen that the human eye doesn't pick up on.
Does that adversely affect the quality of information that they might give to law enforcement, you know, in terms of maybe license plates on a suspect car, or, you know, identification of a suspect, that kind of thing?
Easier with the better quality light.
Okay.
Versus the high pressure sodium.
Good. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Royball.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess a lot of my colleagues here have already brought up these questions, but thank you for taking me through crash course of Lighting 101. It's interesting. Thing that I would probably mention again is each community has a different need and different desires. Ward 3 is probably a lot different than Ward 4, and our needs are a lot different. The other thing that I was going to mention, I like the petition process, which gives skin in the game to the residents. It gets them buy-in, and I think that's really important. The other one that I want to also mention, and obviously this goes without saying, but you guys are the experts. You know, you gave us a crash course 101 on this, but there's so much more information and background that you guys probably didn't want to overwhelm us, and I appreciate that. Thank you. So I would say, considering reaching out to other, besides the law enforcement, maybe the safety like West Metro Fire, and suggest maybe some information from them and what their thoughts are. That might help a little bit in the community in case there's an emergency or something. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Mr. LeBeer.
Thanks, Mike, for the presentation. I'd probably just add that there probably should be some sort of special emphasis for transit areas. You know, you're seeing development happen in our neighborhoods where they build the new development, you know, well into the neighborhood, and it has new lighting and it has new sidewalks, and then there's no lighting or sidewalk connections to the light rail. And I think that's an issue. That's an issue that we've heard pretty frequently with these new developments. These people are spending a ton of money on these new condos, and you know, they have pretty high expectations that they should be able to walk to the light rail, feel safe. And some of the roads that they're expected to walk on are former sort of industrial areas. So now they're walking what seems like a dark alleyway all the way to like Sheridan Light Rail or something like that. So it seems to me that having some sort of emphasis on transit would make some sort of sense and help encourage people to use that mode of transportation and help us with our multimodal you know, emphasis that I think we're working towards in the city. The petition element, I think, makes a lot of sense because, you know, as you've heard from everybody else, I think it does add value, skin in the game, and also it's easy to request things when there's no, you know, effort involved. So you add a petition element, you get citizen involvement, add a fee, whatever that looks like. I think that probably is just a good practice. Obviously, I think more involved lighting policy with developers probably makes sense too, just because then we help get that taken care of on the front end instead of the city putting all the issues on the city. Having the add and remove policy makes sense to me. And then just moving, and this really isn't part of this discussion, but 95% of the lights being Excel Energy, I think us moving towards LED across that entire system makes a lot of sense, not only for reducing energy, but potentially reducing some sort of cost. We're spending $2 million a year on some of that, or 1.5 on energy. You know, seems like there's value moving towards LED for a lot of different reasons. And I think we should be looking at that, and hopefully we'll have that discussion relatively soon. So thanks.
Great. So I think what we've heard is certainly some petitioning, certainly flexibility and understanding what that looks like in different parts of the city, and relying on our experts, whether it's in Public Works, the Police Department, West Metro Fire, kind of all the usual stakeholders, and wrapping that up into something and then coming back with something a little bit more hashed out for council to review. Do you need further clarification on these 9 points, or do you feel like you have enough to work with from what council has mentioned?
I think we're in really good shape. I think you've touched on many of those points in your comments, as those were pretty finely divided and perhaps didn't need to be quite so. So thank you. That's really helpful.
Ms. Hodson? Yep.
I would also add, we heard a lot about safety and public safety. That's an important element, as well as kind of that last mile, the walk from the stations to where they're going. I would add to their residents, I'm sorry. I would add that to kind of those other three you just mentioned, Mayor.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Anything else? Great. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Nice presentation. Very thorough. Well done. Well done, council.
All right.
Well, you know, we actually are behind because our little docket here says we should have been at reports at 8:20. So close. But so yeah, we'll start with reports. Mr. Roybal, anything?
No report.
Mr. LeBear?
No report.
Mr. Abel?
We had a very robust meeting at our Ward 1 monthly meeting. We discussed, had a forum on the Strategic Growth Initiative. I was the moderator, and it was like herding cats. So, but everyone was very cordial and respectful, and there was a lot of information from both sides. So.
Harrison?
Thank you. Ward 5 had our meeting on Saturday, had an excellent discussion on transportation issues, the future of transportation, from Dr. Cog. It was very interesting to hear how our current cars are heading us for non-driver cars. It was very interesting hearing how that's going to affect our transportation needs in the future. Highly recommend that to my other counselors. That was a very lively discussion. Thank you.
Ms. Franks?
Just wanted to let the community know that we will in Ward 4 not have a June meeting, so we look forward to seeing you all in July.
Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. This Saturday at 6 o'clock at the New Hope Ministries, which is at Kentucky and Sheridan, I will be screening the movie Seattle is Dying. There's been a great deal of interest in homelessness, mental illness, and substance abuse. And this will give me and anybody that attends, and everybody is invited and welcome, it's everybody, to actually, for the first time that I'm aware of, to sit down with our community and to hear what's on their mind, to see what they're feeling, what they're thinking. And maybe they've got some ideas that none of us have actually formally looked at. So everybody's invited this Saturday, June 8th at 6 p.m. at New Hope Ministries. Oh, Scott Story will be there to help with the discussion. He'll talk a lot about the DA's office and their interplay with this, and also legislative type things that have come into play. We will have the lead technician or clinician, from the National Addiction Treatment Centers to come and talk about treatment. And then we'll have representatives from our own police department to come and answer some questions and give their input. Everybody is welcome. We can listen to what the community is thinking. Thank you.
Mr. Beta?
Thank you. Just one quick comment. We have our next ward meeting will be June 22nd, I believe, and it's our community picnic. It's our normal ward meeting, but we're going to start at noon instead of 10, and it'll be we provide hot dogs, hamburgers, bratwurst, all that. Everybody's invited, including all of our council. We look forward to having everybody there. That'll be at the Addenbrook Park on June 22nd, starting at noon.
Great. Ms. Vincent?
I'll go chronologically here. This Friday, the 7th, is the first Friday, but it's the first Friday for 40 West Arts, and they call it the one on steroids. They have it every other month. Yeah, it's going to be a circus theme, so there's going to be a lot of things happening on the street and on Colfax and at JCRS, and there'll be a lot of stuff happening. So it's really fun. I'd really encourage anybody, if you've never been to one of these first Fridays on steroids, you'll have a great time. And it's supposed to be nice, I think, too. And then on June 12th, we're having our Ward 2 meeting at 6 o'clock, and it's at the Clements Center. And then we'll have our panel on the Strategic Growth Initiative. And speaking of lights, I want to let the community know this. It's been a concern, the lighting at Mount Air Park, or the lack thereof. So there is a meeting on June 13th at 6 p.m. and it'll be at the Lamar Station at 6150 West 13th, and it'll be the plans for the changing of the lighting. There's been a lot of issues there, so the city's moving forward on that. Thank you.
Great. I think some would say that it could be a circus every day on West Colfax. Not limited to Friday night, but it will be a good one. This is a great event, and if you can get out, check it out. Had the opportunity today. There was a large contingent from Northwest Indiana, folks from the school districts and from cities and towns that are in the metro area visiting Denver, and they came out to Lakewood and toured Belmar, as well as the West Line and the Art Line. So I want to thank Travis and his team for putting that together. It was great to hear from this community, or these community members, about some of the challenges they're facing and versus some of our challenges. And they're dealing with loss of population and things along those lines. So much different, but they are on a rail line. So they're considered in some ways a suburb of Chicago now, even though they're in Indiana. So they're looking for cool ways to reinvent themselves. So that was great. Again, thank you to staff. Saturday night is the Rock and Block Party, which will be a great kickoff to the summer season. That's at 6:30 p.m. And for City Council, there will be an update on the countywide plan for homelessness at the Commissioner Council breakfast on Thursday morning. So there'll be a 15-minute update on what is going on and where we're at. And then the rest of the topic for that meeting will be affordable housing. So if you are a council member and you haven't made plans to go there and you want to get better understanding of what's going on, please check that out. And packets are out for June 10th, so please take the time to dig into that, and staff is available to try to help you through any kinds of questions that you might have. And last but certainly not least, please, please, please slow down. You're probably going to hear that as we continue through. Distracted driving, speeding, not paying attention is really causing a lot of problems. It's been a terrible last 12 months for us, so please, please, please do all you can. That's all I have, Ms. Greer. Mr. Graham, Ms. Hodson. All right, we will adjourn at 8:38. Agent Maines, thank you for keeping us safe tonight. Enjoy your evening.